Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tonellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Joshua Pomare, or JP Pomare as he's otherwise known, is a Melbourne-based New Zealand author who hit the literary scene in 2018 with a best-selling, award-winning debut in his psychological thriller, Me Evie. His success with this book was followed up with In the Clearing in 2019 and then Tell Me Lies in 2020. This year, Joshua is back with another edge-of-your-seat, spine-chilling thriller that will forever leave you nervous about renting a stay in someone else's home. The Last Guests, published by Hachette, is a compelling, tightly woven and suspenseful read I simply could not put down. And I'm super delighted to have the chance to speak with this incredible talent today. Welcome to the podcast, Joshua.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for that very generous introduction.
Oh, it's my pleasure. My goodness, you have had an incredible run of success since Call Me Evie was published. 4 books in 4 years, TV and film adaptations in production or in the pipeline. When you began writing novels, did you imagine or hope that this was what lay in store for you?
Yeah, I think everyone, when I say yeah, it's not in response to that question, by the way. That's me buying time to think. I mean, I was ambitious, but also I think because I'd spoken to a lot of writers and because I think I'm mostly grounded in reality in terms of my expectations, but sometimes you get ahead of yourself and sometimes you get really excited with breakthroughs and moments. But no, I didn't really think it would happen so quickly and not necessarily so well. But of course, it's always, what do they say in like business speak, managing expectations. That's what everyone sort of does around me. They do a really good job of making sure my expectations align with the kind of potential. And so I think with every book, I've got a ceiling and a floor, and sales wise and reception, everything sort of seems to fit somewhere in there. I really hate my books sometimes, and that's usually right before they come out and for the first few weeks, and then I sort of forget about them and start writing something else, and the cycle renews. But yeah, no, I think it's important for all writers to have some level of ambition for their work and some expectation that people will read and take something from it. Otherwise it's pretty pointless sharing it. You can write for yourself if you have no ambition to get it in the hands of readers and to sort of affect them in some way.
Yeah, so true. I read somewhere, Joshua, that you're not entirely sure that you're a crime writer or that it was never your intention to write crime novels. Do you still feel this way, even though you were nominated for a Ned Kelly Award?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's just one of those things where I think lots of crime writers, this is their compromise. And the best crime writers are the ones that always wanted to be crime writers, I think, and have always read crime writing. When I say the best, I mean the most, both the most prolific, but also the most popular tend to be those who read a lot of crime and went out with the intention of selling lots of crime novels. And that was never really my intention. It probably is now, to be honest. I mean, I write books and I hope it sells well, and I hope it's received well. And I know that what I'm working on will be on the crime shelf. Whereas that definitely wasn't the case with Call Me Evie and not so much with In the Clearing either. But by about my third novel, the industry beats you into the shape it sort of wants you to be in. And that tends to be when you're writing not only towards your strength, but towards the commercial potential of your strengths as well. So your editors will recognize that you write suspense well, so they'll edit you in a way where you're going to attract suspense readers or whatever. So, I mean, there's so many forces that push you when you have deadlines and publishing contracts, and so much of it is outside of your control. But the draft I sent to my agent for Call Me Evie, the very first draft, was, I would say, literary, and that was my ambition back then. Yeah, so in a very short version of that answer, I think I and I say this as a joke, but also kind of true. I think I sort of sold out a little bit in that I bent to the will of my agent and publisher, and I'm glad I did as well, I should say, because as I said, I think it's my strength, and I think I'm writing to my strengths, and I think I'm not cut to write the books that I so admired and wanted to write initially, and that's literary fiction. And maybe one day I'll try my hand at it again, but for the time being, I absolutely love a great crime novel as well. So that's that's where I am.
Fantastic. In the crime aisle and happy to be there.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so there was so much to love and admire about The Last Guests, and indeed so much to unpack in relation to it. But I wondered if perhaps we could start with how you came up with the central premise for this novel.
Yeah, sure. So I talk about this a lot, actually. The really moment where it clicked for me was the idea, not writing it, but the moment I had this kind of flash of what the story could be. We were Airbnb-ing our little apartment, which we no longer own, but we had an apartment very close to the MCG and the botanical gardens and the museums and art gallery and stuff in Melbourne. When I say museums and art galleries, I mean NGV. So basically a real touristy hub, really close to CBD. And we would go away. I'm a Kiwi, so we'd go back to New Zealand quite a bit. And we got into this habit, which was great, really great fun too. Before we had a baby, we would just open up the listing for our place. And what would happen is if we got a booking, and it was good, really good money, and we'd get a booking and then we'd go, cool, now where are we going to go? And we'd just go away somewhere. And it was quite fun. And we had lots of interaction with the people who were hosting and that sort of thing. But the very first time we did it, we were really nervous, and we did what everyone does. And we just viewed all the kind of volumes of information that were available to us online about the guests, what people put out there. So we just checked out their LinkedIn and Instagram and Twitter and stuff and Facebook. And that was partly due diligence. You have this kind of curiosity about who you're letting into your home. And so we did that, and we decided, from memory, and I think I've just built this profile in my head, but from memory, it was a couple from Adelaide or outside of Victoria coming to Victoria for a wedding. It was just an older couple, and they seemed nice enough. And so what you also do early on is you want to get 5-star reviews, so more people book in the future and that sort of thing. So we played the game in that we would leave out nice bottles of wine and milk and snacks and things, and we were really generous about it. So that first guest, I think we probably got like a $25 bottle of wine or something. We knew they were going to a wedding, so we left it out for them in a note and stuff. And we came home and we're nervous to see what the state of the apartment was like, but we discovered that bottle of wine was still in the fridge, but there was about a glass of wine missing. And the idea came when I asked my wife, can we drink this? Can we finish this wine? Because in my head, the logical part of me is thinking, well, it's probably about a 1%, I'd say less than 1% chance these kind of sophisticated older couple would swigging straight from the bottle. It was, precisely one glass of wine was missing. This was pre-COVID, so we weren't thinking, we'll catch something. And so we didn't drink it, but I just remember thinking, well, why not? What's the worst that could happen? And, from there, I thought, wow, if I'm being insane, the worst that could happen is they could have put something in the wine. They didn't like the experience, so they put something in the wine, hoping we'd drink it. I'm like, no, but that's so astronomically unlikely. And I go, and even so, that's not the worst thing they could have done. They could have put booby traps through the house or cut the keys. They could have got a copy of the key and they could be coming back later. They could have installed cameras in the house. And then I thought, but why would they want to do that? And I thought, well, maybe they're voyeurs. And so it sort of was born out of that one question, do you think we can drink this wine? And that gave rise to so many other questions, and started to do research and realized this happens. This has happened a lot. Voyeurs have installed cameras in Airbnbs. So that's sort of where that initial idea came from.
So terrifying. As someone who, like you, has been on the Airbnb bandwagon, I can't say this isn't something that has crossed my mind. Not this exact scenario, I must say, but I've certainly thought of squatters and meth labs and damage and things like that. It's such a contemporary and compelling issue, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where the dangers of technologies, I don't think anyone's naive to that, what the potential risks and how we can sort of mitigate those risks with technology. But as surveillance equipment gets smaller and cheaper, and this is with everything, of course, as computers get smaller and cheaper, more people have access to the sort of technology that can conduct fraud or whatever, so with everything, progress and technological advancement obviously brings about greater potential for risks as well. And cameras are so cheap and so tiny. If you look at the quality of a recording you can make on your iPhone, and do it right now, while you listen to this podcast, hold up your iPhone, have a look at the size of that lens in there. Now, that's, big. That lens is big for what you can get. And that's recording, what would have cost tens of thousands of dollars 20 years ago. So full HD, basically the nib of a pen, and you can disguise it behind glass, you can disguise it in screw heads and light fittings and alarm clocks and all sorts of things. So, and as that gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and this market has always existed, but there's always been voyeurs since, the dawn of time. Everyone's being curious about what their neighbors are getting up to. But now the risks are much lower because you're much less likely to be discovered. And not only that, you can view other people's material, so you don't even need to be in the same country as someone to be a voyeur of, their neighbors or whatever. So there's risk there. It's a very contemporary issue, and it's frankly pretty terrifying. But you could have been viewed and you'd never know. So in the same breath, as I say, it's terrifying, it's also largely a victimless crime in the sense that the victims don't even know.
We've talked a lot around the plot of this book, but for those who haven't had the chance to read The Last Guests, as I have, could you tell me more about it?
Yeah, sure. So the central premise is pretty high concept. It's classic. It's Airbnbs, or the equivalent for legal reasons. It's called We Stay in the book. Short stay holiday rentals are being booked by people who want to install cameras in them, and then they'll stream that to voyeurs online. But at the heart of the story, it's really about a relationship. It's about the extent that we would go to live with the things we've done, basically. So how we cope with traumas and guilt, and how, if we get what we want and we sacrifice part of ourselves and we sacrifice our innocence to get what we want and to be the person we are, then how do we reconcile that, and how do we deal with that? And so it's also about secrets and the power that secrets have over us, and that sort of paranoia about them, because this is a couple who are married, both want different things, and when they get what they want, they're much more miserable, and they actually lose a lot of what it was they loved about each other. So it's about that as well, this sort of staying power and the power of secrets.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating read, as I said in my introduction. Now, it's set in New Zealand between Auckland and Lake Tarawera. I hope I've said that correctly. And as I said earlier, you were born in New Zealand. Is this particular place somewhere that you're familiar with, and how did you choose this setting?
Yeah, I am actually. It's Lake Tarawera is very close to my hometown, Aotearoa, which is middle of the North Island. And I spent a lot of time out there. I've got friends in the lakes, general lakes area out that side. So there's Lake Okaraka and there's the Blue Lake, Lake Rotoiti. These are all places that are much the same, but also have the sort of slight variations in terms of locals, in terms of what percentage of the population are holiday makers and what percent are full-timers. Lake Tarawera is huge, and it is literally combustible in the sense that it's on a volcano that was the biggest. I think it might be the biggest eruption on record in New Zealand, Tarawera eruption, because it was a mountain, it was a volcano, and the crater blew up, and that's what created this lake. It's just beautiful. It's one of those spots that tourists miss. It's out of the way. It's off State Highway 1, which is the road that passes through pretty much every town in New Zealand. So it's out of the way. It gets missed by tourists. The locals absolutely love it. It's a bit of a secret, but there's potential for tension there as well because of that. And Auckland's obviously the reason I was attracted to Auckland is because there's a absolute crisis with housing and affordability. It's one of the world's most livable cities, but it's horrible if you're not that close to the city and you need to get in. Like traffic is, I don't think, I've ever lived or visited a city outside of maybe Delhi in India and some cities in Southeast Asia. But in terms of, the Western world, that Auckland's can be such a frustrating place to live. But I love the city. And if you're not quite in the band of wealth required to be comfortable there, then it's just full-time stress. People who live there are really, they've got big mortgages, they've got long, hard commute. So it's a lot of stress. I thought if you are in that band where you love the city, you kind of want to live there, your jobs are there, but you can't really afford it, that just adds another level to it in terms of what I can put my characters through. And that's what sort of drives often dubious decisions. Decision making is that desperation. And I wanted to say something about class a little bit as well. I think gentrification in Auckland's been pretty rapid, same with lots of places, but what it means for West Auckland and South Auckland, what it means for those communities that have lived there for years, that are largely, particularly in South Auckland, there's lots of people from Pacific Islands in South Auckland, lots of Maori people as well. It's inevitable that these places, the gentrification will drive them out. And so I sort of wanted to talk about that, how the city is changing. And in the end, my characters are deciding if it's time to get out.
Yes, indeed. We already talked a little bit about voyeurism, and you've touched on this as well, but how seemingly easy it is for us to leave a digital footprint of our movement. You said that you don't think a lot of people can be, naive to the fact that this is what happens. But I mean, just in preparing for this interview, for example, I did some cursory searches of your social media accounts, articles you've written, interviews you've given, and no doubt people have and can do the same about me, know where I live, how many children I have, or where I went to school and university. Do you think this is something people don't really give much thought about anymore, or something we should be concerned about?
I mean, I find it particularly challenging because I feel obligation as a requirement of being an author who isn't Sally Rooney. I have to have some level of presence online. I have to make myself available to strangers to sort of interact with me, basically. And what that means is the more you give of yourself, the happier your publicist is in particular, but the happier the readers are, and the more they can engage with you. And I see it work, and that's sort of the problem here. That's a different form of interaction than tech or phone addiction or social media addiction, which is, I would say, more people are addicted to social media than anything, I reckon. More people are addicted to their phones than anything else. And that might be me speaking from a place of privilege where everyone has a smartphone. So maybe I'm speaking particularly about the wealthiest countries where everyone's got phones and full-time internet access and so on and so forth. But it's insidious, and it's growing and it's growing and it's growing. And we don't have any natural defenses to the level of manipulation and the level of, we're talking about people who have studied for 10 years behavioral economics, and they are paid a lot of money to make us more addicted to this. If it was a harmful substance, and it is harmful, but if it was something that was more obviously harmful, people would be outraged that psychologists have been paid so much to make us more addicted. So the thing I find most fascinating about the whole thing is, and this is my personal experience, because I wasn't on anything, no Twitter, no Facebook, no Instagram, and then I published a book and I think I had a Twitter account, but I didn't use it. And I published a book, and then, I started a podcast actually, and there's a requirement, certainly on Twitter and stuff, to promote the authors who come on. But you're giving up less of yourself if you're using Twitter as a promotional tool. But as soon as you use Instagram or Facebook, which are much more visual mediums, then you're giving up information about yourself, pictures and things. And I've found I've become addicted, and I have to, I broke my phone in New Zealand. I ran over it with a luge cart, which is a whole nother story. And I decided not to replace it for a long time, for probably 6 or 8 weeks. And this was right up until just after my book came out. And obviously my publicist is pulling her hair out, my wife is pulling her hair out, and everyone else. But I just saw it as a good hard reset, a good hard stop on my addiction to these things. So is there a problem with them? In my view, yeah, because one, no one reads the terms and conditions, but two, as I said, there's no natural defense to this. You're getting marketed to. Your thinking is being changed. You are believing the most fantastical things possibly because of how compelling it is on social media. Your views and standards of beauty are changing. Your expectations, your self-esteem is dropping.
Yeah.
You're being exposed to vetted and doctored and photoshopped images and a reality of other people's lives that simply doesn't match their actual existence. So all of this is so toxic, but no one thinks too much about the privacy concerns as well. So the fact that you're giving so much to companies that's only interest is to take your money and sell you things you probably don't need. But not only that, there's privacy concerns in terms of stalkers and stalking, and you're putting your kids' images online. And I've done this before as well. I don't have consent from my daughter to put her pictures online where they'll be forever and anyone can use. And I often think about a conversation I'll have with her one day when she's 16 or 18 or 21 or 25 or 30 or whatever. And strangers have all these images and all this private data and information about her. And at no point in time had I stopped to get her consent. So there's so much here that's ugly. And in this book, I wanted to point to the more tangible kind of threats, and that's if you say a fitness app and you go for a run. Every time you go for a run, it starts from your house, and the default setting on these apps is public availability in terms of your data and information. So everyone can search your name, find you on this app, and see where you start your run and where you finish your run. And it doesn't take a brain decision to determine that's likely where you live. They also know what times you run if you run at night. If you're running at night at a park, your diet will be on there, the cafes you go to because you post your coffee in the morning, the people you hang out with, So this, just in terms of the actual threat of stalking and the tangible threat of being stalked or assaulted or whatever, it's very, very real. It's not something you can click your fingers and make it go away as well, because you don't know who's been watching this whole time.
Yeah, absolutely terrifying on so many levels, I have to say. Okay, so we talked a little bit about Lena and her husband Kane a bit before. They're an interesting couple, to say the least. They love each other for sure. Each harbours some very deep secrets, as well as nursing deep psychological trauma. So I wanted to know, Joshua, how did you get inside their heads?
Yeah, good question. I mean, they get in my head as much as I get in theirs, I should say. So I sort of, less so than some authors, but I method write in that I, live like my characters accidentally. It's not planned. It's not a writing strategy, so to speak. But certainly with Kane, I got really, really fit. Really, really fit. Not obviously not SAS fit, but I got as fit as I've ever been. I shaved my head, and which I did for Evie as well. I started gambling because he's addicted to gambling, and wanted to sort of understand how that world worked. But then I sort of, outside of research, was like, oh, well, I'm doing it. And in this way, I sort of become these characters while I'm writing them. And with Lena, so Kane was also speaking with former SAS members and reading and understanding. I think most importantly for me, the research about him was understanding the psychological effect of killing someone, in the way that our soldiers are primed to be desensitized to that and view that the act of killing is something that's morally permissible and that sort of thing. But with Lena, I was speaking a lot with a paramedic, because she's a paramedic, and understanding what that trauma does to people and the desperation. And, Lena in the book is pretty keen to have children. And part of that's because all of a sudden her life's different and she can escape this world, but she doesn't confront that. And I don't even know if the reader really reckons with that either, but that's part of what makes her character up, is why she wants to have a kid. And part of that is to escape this life, because if you are a paramedic in a city, you're going to see horribly traumatic things every single day. Not to mention the pressure and stress. And there's a great deal of addiction with medical professionals and anaesthetists and paramedics, largely because they have access to fentanyl and stuff like that, but also largely because of the level of exposure to reasonably traumatic things as well. Yeah, so sort of getting in their head was, getting in their head. Just sometimes I'll write journal entries and things like that. I'll try to go where they would go and do what they would do, and then I often form habits they have and that sort of thing as well. And then I go to write the next book, and I have a new kind of obsession, being new characters, and then that's I'm pulled in that direction. They were a lot of fun to write, I'll say that as well, because they kind of, I find messed up people pretty fun to kind of interrogate, and poke at and see how they react in certain situations.
You wrote about some of your own experiences with violence and their lasting psychological impacts. I wondered if that helped you when it came to writing Gleaner and Kane and the things that they went through.
Yeah, I mean, I assume you're talking about, we had a home invasion.
That's right.
Yeah. So we, long story short, we had someone came to a house with a knife in the middle of the day and stole our car and came into our house. And this came while I was editing the book. This happened. Yeah, I guess it sort of contextualized violence for me, or at least the threat of violence, and where we go in those moments, because I surprise myself in my reaction. I don't really ever get angry, and it was an instant level of rage when I discovered someone was in my house, and I ran in to confront this person. Daytime regular JP wouldn't think like that, but it was just sort of this instinctive thing. But then, of course, after that as well, and the aftermath, which is so much of this book is about the aftermath, and the way a place changes when something quite scary or horrible happens to you there. Instantly, the fear module has registered the place possibly that you live, in our case, as a enormously threatening environment. And you can't combat that with logic. The only way to get over it is exposure therapy, basically, which is a fancy name for simply confronting that which you're afraid of, and that can backfire too if you're immersed in that fear. If the stimulus is too great, that makes the fear worse. So it was, in saying that, what I mean is we couldn't, recreate that scene and expect to feel better about it. But it was just a slow thing of being comfortable in the house again and going into rooms together and turn the lights on and not trying to outthink it, but also just finding some sort of sense of peace with it. And so that was all of that really informed my approach certainly in the later editing stages, and trying to make that experience authentic, one of the home invasion, but two of the aftermath.
There were certainly some major red herrings in this book, with a major plot twist that left me speechless at the end. So I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about your process.
I mean, I'd give a different answer to this every time, because as I'm writing, I realise it's slightly different each book. But I think really, I don't always have the twist on first, second, third drafts, but I look at the assumptions that a reader's making, because the twist is simply you subverting, something the reader believes. And the more fundamental that belief that you subvert, the bigger the twists. I mean, I say, like, the biggest twists are the ones that people aren't looking for, and that could be where you place it. If there's a huge twist, 10 pages in and it works, that's what could make that twist great, is the fact that people aren't expecting a twist, So there's when I'm writing surprises and little twists and big twists throughout my work, I'm really just trying to put myself in the reader's shoes and think, what do they fundamentally believe here, and what can I subvert? But what also tends to happen is between edits, when I'm walking or sitting and I'm thinking deeply, I'm trying to actively deepen my imagining of the story. So I'm making myself imagine a scene, and I'm going, cool, what's in the corner? Which character's there? What's the weather doing? What can they smell? What can they taste? So I'm at really trying to, immerse myself in the scene. And then when I'm doing these kind of exercises, I'm just thinking really deeply about a scene and not thinking about a twist. Sometimes something just unlocks, it's just got nothing to do with plot or anything like that. But sometimes I just think, what if this is this person? And the other thing I'd say about with this twist in this book, it was inevitable how this story kind of concluded, for me anyway. Other people would disagree, but when I was writing this was always sort of the ending, right? So that wasn't me planning a twist. This was always how it ended. But then I just thought, how can I structure this in a way that it'll still be surprising? What can I kind of what scenes can I refine so they end before you find something out. So basically it's just an active sleight of hand at that stage. Everything's there the whole way through, but I'm just choosing which details to withhold to heighten that twist. But in saying that, like I said, it wasn't a twist, 10 drafts ago. It's something that was sort of teased down the editing process.
As we said before we started recording, you and I have something in common in that we're both podcasters. I've listened to your wonderful podcast called On Writing. So I wanted to ask you, why did you start the podcast, and did it help with your writing, do you think?
Well, the second part of that question's, very easy in that it helps a lot. And that's because I'm doing what you're doing now, and that's speaking with other writers, and in earnest as well, I should say. I started that podcast because, at the time, we go back to, I think it's 2016, maybe 2015, 2016. At the time, there was like one other writing podcast, right? So, and they weren't asking the questions that I was that interested in. Although that writing podcast was probably 10 times more popular than my one, I started it because, one, I was naive to, how hard it would be. But two, I thought, I don't think there's a market for this, or I could make money. I just thought this could be an avenue for me to ask questions that I actually want and that I'm interested in. And I was listening to a few, one or two American ones. There's nothing I found particularly exciting about them, and they weren't Australian guests anyway, and so when they were talking about New York publishing, it's slightly different to Australian. So that's why I started, and I didn't look back once. When I was doing it, I loved it. And I should say it's been a year since I did an episode, and I can't say for sure if I'll do another one, to be honest. I don't miss it so much now, but that space has been filled. If I want to, I know which podcasts I like now, and I can go to those to hear interviews and stuff like that. And if I really want to speak to an author, it's slightly easier now to approach them. They might actually read my email because I feel like I'm in the club. Maybe I'm not, but it's slightly more accessible. You bump into people you like, and green rooms and stuff like that at writers' festivals, or you've got a friend in common, or you have the same agent or whatever. So I do meet more writers now, and that was the other thing about it. I was meeting, I was interviewing like Trent Dalton and Christian White and Sophie Laguna and Joyce Carol Oates, and all these writers are so admiring of, and there's no way in how that would have happened otherwise. So I was already kind of in the club before I was in the club, which made it much more realistic as well, because you're getting all this feedback, and you're finding, as you said earlier, you're finding that everyone's got a different approach and everyone's got a different story, and there's no right way to do it. That was the other thing as well.
Talking about being in the club, I just feel like, particularly with Australian authors, that I started virtually cold calling people and asking them if they would be on the podcast. And I'm talking from a place of, not having anything published and not really being known by anyone. But I just think it's a testament to how wonderful the Australian writing community is, in that most people will answer an email from you and will be happy to speak to you on your podcast, even if they've never heard of you before. Don't know anything about your podcast. I think it really does say a lot about how wonderful this community really is.
Yeah, cynically, I'd say it also says a lot about, two things: publicity in Australia as well, but also the level of engagement with the writing community from non-writers as well. So like people I know friends and things who've listened to writing podcasts who aren't writers as well. So, maybe that happens all around the world, but I think that particularly in Australia, writers' festivals are, really popular with just readers. I think that's also why it's quite important, I think, to engage in this way as well. So
after 4 books, are there things you know about yourself or have learned about your writing that you didn't know before you were published?
Yeah, there are. I sometimes I look back at early interviews and things and cringe, and I'm sort of just this, wide-eyed. I talk about how much it prepared me to be a writer, having a podcast. But you still, this first 1 or 2 books, you very much are still, you feel like a tourist. And I think maybe I was still childish, I was in my late 20s when I got my first publishing contract. I think every year I change a lot, but I think something changes. There's a big kind of tectonic shift when you hit 30, I think. And so I think I'm a really different person now than I was. And whether or not that's anything to do with publishing books or being in this community, I can't say for sure. But I'd say it has a lot to do with it as being, as small as my audience may be, being in the public eye and having speaking gigs and writers' festivals and meeting people who are, again, as small as this community is, meeting people who are fans, that what that does is, depending on your personality and your sort of self-concept, I suppose. But if it's not important for you that you've got fans, when you do meet people who love your work, it's still immensely gratifying. And you may not be writing for that may not be the destination, so to speak, but it's still a pretty special thing, I think. So and that's why all writers say reach out. If you loved a book, get in touch, send them an email or whatever, contact them on Instagram. That's changed me a lot as well. In terms of my writing and my approach, I think I'm more professional now. I think what I want to do has changed. I wanted to write something different every single time, and I still do, but the commercial realities in the industry will often derail those plans a little bit. You really can't be too experimental if you've got 6 months to write a novel. In saying that, I try to, now I'm negotiating, it's my decision, but I'm chatting with my agent about possibly taking more time between books, possibly doing side projects as well, looking at potentially, this is not, hot off the press really, but I've been speaking with a screenwriter and talking about that as a fun side project, have a year off and do that, which is a real privilege, I should say, as well. I think when you're writing crime fiction and your books are popular enough, you have that as an option. There's lots that's changed, and I think I haven't really, I don't know, I feel like I haven't fully cemented myself as a crime writer right in my little niche, but that's certainly the expectation of me. And when you're writing towards that, it's a different kind of writing than pure, a pure creative, totally authentic thing. You do think about the audience, and you do think about your publisher and that sort of thing. So in that respect, it's changed as well.
If you had a tip or two to offer an aspiring writer, what would you say?
I would say my general advice, I try not to be too general, cliche, but everyone, the advice I'd give to someone on their 10th draft of a crime manuscript and the advice I'd give to someone writing poetry are two fundamentally different things. So I try not to be too vague, but I'd say, one, engage the community as much as you can. We're all pretty introverted, so I would accept if you didn't want to go join a writers group or whatever, but if you go to readings, the bookshop, but not the bookshop, if you go to poetry readings, if you're a poet, or short story readings or whatever, if you turn up at other people's book launches and do that sort of thing, that's fine. But I think writers groups, and if you can afford it, workshops and things like that. If you can't, apply for grants or whatever. If you can access some education and those are the two most important things, I think, is engaging the community and growing your craft and developing your craft. And when I say that, there are things that do both at the same time. That's writers groups. I think if you can join a writers group, you're going to be much more objective about your work because you are reading other people's work who also think it's the next monkey grip. So you can read theirs and go, hey, they think that, and it's not. So maybe I'm wrong about how good my stuff is. And then you become more objective about your work and learn to edit and stuff like that. So, but not only that, like I said, when your book does get published, people turn up to your launch. You'll have friends who might get published and they can put you in touch with the agent and stuff like that. So just there's no downside really to meeting other writers and engaging the community. And the other thing I'd say is, and this sucks to hear, but it's you got to hear it. And if you don't like it, you maybe you should take up fishing or something else, because you won't probably make it as a writer. But just write every day. And when I say that, people think, that means keep a journal, or that means work on a novel every day. It really doesn't. Just even if you're reading a book and you like it, just write out the scene. Just write the same scene word for word if you want. And it's the same with reading. Read what you want, but make sure you do it. And when I say read what you want, don't force yourself to read Ulysses, because you're going to hate it, and then you're going to read less. And it's the same with writing. Don't think you have to write a certain way. So just open a book and read a scene and go, okay, how would I write the scene? And then write it out if you want. It's as simple as that. If you want to read Ulysses, fill your boots. And if you want to write some insanely dense or complex literary scene, do that as well. My point is write and read precisely what you want, but make sure you're doing it.
I love that advice. Thank you so very much. Joshua, I thoroughly enjoyed the last guests. It was a fascinating and compelling insight into human behaviours. Congratulations once again, and thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been fun. Like I said earlier, it's my birthday tomorrow. So if you want to give me a birthday present, listeners, go to the library and get my book out or buy it. Even better.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.